Captain Sarah Chun never expected her morning coffee to be interrupted by the sound of air raid sirens. The young pilot sat in the mess hall at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, quietly reviewing flight manuals while her fellow pilots joked loudly at nearby tables. At 28, Sarah had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled F-22 Raptor pilots in the Air Force, but respect didn't come easily in a field dominated by men who questioned whether someone her size could handle the world's most advanced fighter jet. The sirens cut through the morning chatter like a knife. Within seconds, the relaxed atmosphere transformed into controlled chaos as pilots and ground crew rushed toward their stations. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She abandoned her half-finished breakfast and sprinted toward the flight line, her combat boots echoing against the concrete as she joined the stream of personnel heading to their aircraft. The briefing room buzzed with tension as pilots gathered around the large tactical display. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, the squadron commander, stood at the front with a grave expression that Sarah had learned to recognize over her 5 years of service. His weathered face and silver hair spoke of decades spent in cockpits and command centers dealing with situations that most people could only imagine in nightmares. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a drill," Colonel Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. The room fell silent. At 0730 hours, our early warning systems detected multiple unidentified aircraft approaching the eastern seaboard. These contacts are moving fast and maintaining radio silence despite repeated attempts at communication. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she studied the tactical display. Red dots moved across the screen like digital predators, their flight paths suggesting coordination and hostile intent. Her analytical mind, trained through countless hours of simulation and real-world exercises, immediately began calculating intercept courses and engagement scenarios. Intelligence suggests these are advanced enemy fighters, possibly belonging to a hostile nation that has been developing stealth technology, the colonel continued. Their capabilities are unknown, but we must assume they pose a significant threat to civilian populations and military installations along the coast. The room erupted in hushed discussions as pilots processed the gravity of the situation. Sarah remained silent, her dark eyes fixed on the display as she memorized the enemy formation patterns. She had always possessed an unusual ability to visualize three-dimensional aerial combat scenarios in her mind, a skill that had earned her top marks in every training exercise she had ever participated in. "Captain Chun," Colonel Rodriguez called out, causing several heads to turn in her direction. "You'll be flying solo reconnaissance. Your mission is to gather intelligence on these unknown aircraft while maintaining a safe distance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." Sarah nodded, though she noticed the subtle exchanges of glances between some of her male colleagues. She had grown accustomed to being assigned support roles rather than primary combat missions, despite consistently outperforming many of her peers in training exercises. The military's old-fashioned attitudes about women in combat roles died hard, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of capability. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a pilot Sarah's age with blonde hair and an ego to match his considerable flying skills, leaned forward in his chair. "Sir, shouldn't we send multiple aircraft for reconnaissance? If these hostiles are as dangerous as intelligence suggests, a single plane might not return with useful information." The colonel's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Captain Chun has logged more flight hours in the F-22 than any pilot in this squadron. Her aircraft is equipped with the most advanced sensor package available, and her record speaks for itself. She can gather the intelligence we need without compromising our primary defense formation." Sarah appreciated the colonel's confidence, though she understood the underlying politics. By sending her on a reconnaissance mission, he could satisfy the demands for action while keeping her away from direct combat, where her gender might become a liability in the eyes of military bureaucrats who still question women's roles in fighter aircraft. The briefing concluded with standard operational procedures and communication protocols. Sarah gathered her flight gear and headed toward the locker room, where she began the methodical process of suiting up for high-altitude combat operations. The G-suit, helmet, oxygen system, and survival equipment had become as familiar to her as civilian clothes, each piece serving a critical function in keeping her alive at altitudes and speeds that would kill an unprotected human being. As she walked toward her aircraft, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in San Francisco, she had been fascinated by aviation from an early age. Her parents, both engineers, had encouraged her interest in science and technology, never suggesting that her gender should limit her aspirations. She had excelled in mathematics and physics throughout school, eventually earning a degree in aerospace engineering before joining the Air Force. Flight training had been brutal but rewarding. Sarah's small stature, initially seen as a disadvantage, actually proved beneficial in high-G maneuvering situations where larger pilots might lose consciousness. Her quick reflexes and analytical thinking helped her master complex aircraft systems faster than many of her classmates. Most importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of aerial combat that instructors said couldn't be taught. The F-22 Raptor stood before her like a sleeping predator, its angular stealth design making it appear more like a piece of abstract sculpture than a weapon of war. Sarah had always felt a deep connection to this particular aircraft, tail number 04-4068, which she had nicknamed Ghost Rider for its ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar screens like a phantom. Master Sergeant Tony Valdez, Sarah's dedicated crew chief, approached with his usual pre-flight checklist. The veteran enlisted man had initially been skeptical about working with a female pilot, but 3 years of flawless operations had transformed him into one of her strongest supporters. His weathered hands moved expertly over the aircraft's exterior, checking control surfaces, weapon systems, and sensor arrays with the precision of someone who understood that a pilot's life depended on his attention to detail. "She's ready for you, Captain," Valdez reported with a slight smile. "All systems green, sensors calibrated, and I've loaded the reconnaissance pod with the latest electronic warfare countermeasures. If those unknown hostiles try to lock onto you, Ghost Rider will give them a headache." Sarah performed her own exterior inspection, a ritual she never skipped regardless of how much she trusted her crew chief. She checked the engine intakes for debris, examined the stealth coating for any damage that might compromise the aircraft's radar signature, and verified that all external systems were properly secured. The F-22's sophisticated design demanded respect and careful attention to detail. Climbing into the cockpit felt like entering a technological cathedral. The advanced displays and controls surrounded Sarah with information about every aspect of the aircraft performance and the surrounding environment. She began the startup sequence, watching as systems came online one by one. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up with a distinctive whine that built to a controlled roar, their combined 70,000 pounds of thrust ready to propel her toward whatever waited in the eastern sky. Ground control cleared her for immediate takeoff, and Sarah taxied Ghost Rider toward the active runway. The tower's urgent tone reflected the seriousness of the situation developing along the coast. As she aligned the fighter with the runway centerline, Sarah took a deep breath and focused her mind on the mission ahead. The takeoff roll felt like controlled violence as the F-22's engines pushed her back into the ejection seat with tremendous force. The runway lights blurred past her canopy as the fighter accelerated toward rotation speed. At 180 knots, Sarah pulled back gently on the stick, and Ghost Rider lifted off the Nevada desert like a mechanical bird of prey seeking altitude and speed. Climbing through 10,000 feet, Sarah engaged the F-22's Super Cruise capability, allowing her to maintain supersonic speed without afterburners. This feature would be crucial for the reconnaissance mission, providing both speed and fuel efficiency while minimizing the aircraft's infrared signature. The landscape below shrank away as she climbed toward her assigned altitude of 45,000 feet. The flight eastward gave Sarah time to review her mission parameters and study the latest intelligence updates transmitted to her aircraft's computers. The unknown hostiles have been detected by multiple radar stations and satellite sensors, confirming their reality and apparent hostile intent. Their formation suggested military discipline and advanced training, ruling out the possibility of civilian aircraft off course or confused. As she crossed into Colorado airspace, Sarah began receiving updates from AWACS aircraft monitoring the situation from a safe distance. The enemy formation had split into multiple groups, with some aircraft apparently targeting military installations while others headed toward major population centers. The complexity of their coordinated attack suggested months or years of planning. Ghost Rider, this is Crown Control, came the voice of the AWACS controller. Hostile contacts now estimated at 12 aircraft in 3 separate formations. Primary group bearing 090 degrees, range 200 nautical miles from your position, and closing fast. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while adjusting her course to intercept the nearest enemy formation. Her mission remained reconnaissance, but she knew that circumstances might force her into combat whether she was authorized or not. The F-22's advanced radar system began painting a clearer picture of the hostile aircraft as she closed the distance. The enemy fighters appear to be using some form of stealth technology, making them difficult to track consistently. Their radar signatures appeared and disappeared like ghosts, suggesting either advanced electronic countermeasures or genuinely sophisticated stealth capabilities. Sarah's respect for these unknown adversaries grew as she observed their tactical discipline and apparent technological sophistication. At 100 miles from the nearest hostile formation, Sarah began employing the F-22's passive sensors to gather intelligence without revealing her own position. The aircraft's advanced electronic systems painted a detailed picture of the enemy fighters' emissions, helping to identify their possible origin and capabilities. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. The enemy aircraft were broadcasting identification codes that matched no known military force. Their electronic signatures suggested a level of technological advancement that rivaled or potentially exceeded American capabilities. These were not outdated fighters flown by inexperienced pilots. They were cutting-edge weapons systems operated by professionals who understood modern aerial warfare. Crown Control, Ghost Rider, Sarah transmitted on the encrypted frequency. Contact analysis suggests hostile aircraft are equipped with advanced stealth and electronic warfare systems. Recommend upgrading threat assessment to maximum level. The response from the AWACS controller confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Copy, Ghost Rider. Intelligence concurs with your assessment. New orders from command. You are cleared to engage if hostile intent is confirmed. Repeat, you are cleared to engage. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized her reconnaissance mission had just transformed into a potential combat operation. She was alone, facing an unknown number of advanced enemy fighters with capabilities she could only guess at. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, but her training kept her focused on the tactical situation. The nearest enemy formation had detected her presence and was maneuvering to investigate. Sarah watched her displays as 4 hostile contacts turned in her direction, their course changes indicating they had somehow penetrated her stealth signature or detected her electronic emissions. The game of cat and mouse was about to become deadly serious. Sarah checked her weapons systems one final time, ensuring that all 6 AIM, 120 AMRAAM missiles, and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders were ready for immediate use. The F-22's internal weapons bay design maintained her stealth characteristics while providing formidable offensive capability. She also verified that her 20mm cannon was armed and ready, though she hoped the situation wouldn't deteriorate to close-range combat. The enemy fighters were now 50 miles away and closing fast. Sarah could see them on her radar display as 4 distinct contacts flying in a tight formation that spoke of professional training and coordination. Their approach vector suggested they intended to bracket her position, using superior numbers to overcome any technological advantages she might possess. "This is it," Sarah whispered to herself as she prepared for what might be the most important fight of her life. "Time to show them what this lady can do." The eastern sky ahead of her began to fill with the electronic signatures of approaching combat, and Sarah Chun prepared to face an enemy that had already made the fatal mistake of underestimating her capabilities. The young pilot, who had been dismissed by some of her colleagues as merely adequate, was about to demonstrate why the F-22 Raptor in the right hands could be the most devastating weapon in the sky. As the range closed to 40 miles, Sarah's threat warning system began detecting targeting radars from the approaching enemy formation. The electronic warfare battle had begun, and she was no longer just gathering intelligence. She was fighting for her life, and possibly for the safety of millions of civilians who had no idea that their protection depended on a young woman they had never heard of, flying alone against impossible odds in the morning sky above America. The moment Sarah's threat warning receiver lit up like a Christmas tree, she knew the enemy had made their intentions clear. For distinct radar locks painted her aircraft from different angles, confirming that the approaching fighters were not interested in peaceful identification. The high-pitched tone in her headset indicated multiple targeting systems were actively tracking Ghost Rider, preparing for missile launch. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive. Years of training had programmed her reactions to threats, and she began evasive maneuvering while simultaneously preparing her own weapon systems for engagement. The F-22 responded to her inputs like a natural extension of her will, rolling into a steep dive while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse incoming missiles that might already be in the air. "Ground control, Ghost Rider is taking fire," she transmitted while pulling the aircraft through a series of high G turns designed to defeat radar tracking. "Confirm weapons free for immediate engagement." The AWACS controller's response crackled through her headset with unusual urgency. "Ghost Rider, weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Splash those hostiles before they reach populated areas." Sarah's tactical display showed the 4 enemy fighters had separated into 2 pairs, attempting to bracket her position with a classic pincer movement. The lead pair was approaching from her 11 o'clock position, while the trailing pair swung wide to attack from her 7 o'clock. Their coordination suggested extensive training in formation tactics and air-to-air combat. The F-22's advanced radar system provided Sarah with a clear picture of the developing engagement. The enemy aircraft appeared to be single-seat fighters roughly comparable in size to her own aircraft, but their exact configuration remained unclear due to their stealth characteristics. What was certain was their aggressive intent and professional execution of attack maneuvers. Sarah selected her first AM-120 AMRAAM missile and designated the lead hostile aircraft as her primary target. The advanced radar-guided weapon could engage targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles, but she wanted to close the distance to ensure maximum probability of kill. At 35 miles, she achieved a solid lock on the lead enemy fighter and squeezed the trigger. The missile bay doors opened briefly as the AMRAAM dropped clear of the aircraft before its rocket motor ignited. Sarah watched the missile streak away toward its target while immediately maneuvering to avoid return fire. The enemy fighters had undoubtedly detected her missile launch and would be responding with their own weapons. Her threat warning system confirmed her suspicions as multiple missile launches appeared on her display. At least 3 enemy missiles were now tracking toward her position, their high-speed approach requiring immediate and violent evasive action. Sarah threw the F-22 into a series of barrel rolls and diving turns that would have been impossible in older generation fighters. The first enemy missile passed close enough that Sarah could see its exhaust trail through her canopy as it streaked past her aircraft. Her countermeasures had successfully spoofed its guidance system, but 2 more missiles were still tracking her with deadly accuracy. She dispensed another cloud of chaff and flares while diving toward lower altitude where the denser air might help defeat the incoming threats. Sarah's first AMRAAM found its target with devastating effect. The lead enemy fighter disappeared from her radar display in a brief bloom of electromagnetic energy that indicated a successful intercept. 1 down, 3 to go, but the remaining hostile pilots had learned from their leader's mistake and were now employing more sophisticated evasive tactics. The second enemy missile detonated close enough to Ghost Rider that Sarah felt the aircraft shudder from the explosion shockwave. Fragments from a warhead peppered her aircraft skin, but the F-22's robust construction and redundant systems kept all critical components operational. Her damage assessment display showed minor hits to non-essential systems, nothing that would affect her ability to continue fighting. Sarah reversed her turn and climbed back toward higher altitude, using the F-22's superior performance to gain both energy and positional advantage over her adversaries. The remaining 3 enemy fighters had reformed their attack formation and were approaching from different angles, clearly adapting their tactics to deal with her aircraft's capabilities. The second pair of enemy fighters had taken position for a beam attack from Sarah's 9 o'clock position, forcing her to divide her attention between multiple threats approaching from different directions. She selected her second AMRAAM and targeted the nearest hostile contact while keeping the other threats under surveillance with her peripheral sensors. At 28 miles, Sarah achieved lock-on and fired her second missile. The AMRAAM raced away toward its target while she immediately began evasive maneuvering to defeat the return fire that would surely follow. The enemy pilots were proving to be skilled adversaries who understood modern beyond visual range combat tactics. The third enemy missile streaked past Sarah's aircraft as she pulled through a crushing 8G turn that tested the limits of both her aircraft and her physical endurance. Her G-suit inflated to prevent blackout, but she could feel the blood draining from her head as the massive forces tried to overwhelm her body's ability to maintain consciousness. Sarah's second missile strike illuminated the sky with another successful intercept. The targeted enemy fighter vanished from her sensors, leaving 2 hostile contacts still actively engaged in combat. The remaining enemy pilots were now showing signs of increased caution, having witnessed the destruction of half their formation in less than 2 minutes of engagement. The surviving enemy fighters changed their tactics, attempting to force Sarah into a turning fight where their superior numbers might compensate for any technological disadvantages. They split up and approached from opposite directions, hoping to catch her in a crossfire situation where evasive maneuvering against one threat would expose her to attack from the other. Sarah recognized the classic 2 versus 1 scenario and responded with her own tactical innovation. Instead of attempting to fight both enemies simultaneously, she used the F-22's superior speed and acceleration to separate the threats temporarily. She accelerated toward one enemy fighter while keeping the other at maximum radar range, forcing them to fight her one at a time rather than in coordination. The nearest enemy pilot seemed to anticipate Sarah's strategy and attempted to merge for close-range combat where his aircraft's maneuverability might prove decisive. Sarah obliged him by accepting the merge, but she had no intention of engaging in a turning dogfight where pilot skill and aircraft performance would be equally matched. As the range closed to visual contact, Sarah got her first clear look at the enemy aircraft. The fighter was sleek and angular, with design characteristics that suggested advanced stealth technology and sophisticated aerodynamics. Its pilot was clearly skilled, maintaining perfect formation discipline while maneuvering for an advantageous attack position. At 8 miles, Sarah fired her third AMRAAM in a head-on engagement that gave the enemy pilot minimal time to react. The missile covered the distance between the 2 aircraft in less than 10 seconds, but the enemy pilot proved his skill by successfully defeating the attack with a combination of chaff dispensing and violent maneuvering that broke the missile's guidance lock. The miss forced Sarah to accept close-range combat whether she preferred it or not. The enemy fighter was now within visual range and closing fast, its pilot clearly intent on forcing a gun's engagement where individual skill and aircraft performance would determine the outcome. Sarah prepared for the kind of aerial duel that fighter pilots have been fighting since the early days of military aviation. The two fighters merged at a combined closing speed of over 1,500 miles per hour, each pilot maneuvering desperately to gain position on his opponent while avoiding becoming a target himself. Sarah pulled Ghost Rider through a vertical climb that tested the limits of the F-22's thrust-to-weight ratio, hoping to use superior performance to gain an energy advantage. The enemy pilot matched her climb initially, but began falling behind as the F-22's superior engines provided more thrust at high altitude. Sarah rolled over the top of her climb and dove back toward her opponent, attempting to convert her altitude advantage into a successful attack position. The enemy fighter tried to evade by turning perpendicular to her attack vector, but Sarah had anticipated the maneuver. She fired a short burst from her 20mm cannon at maximum range, more to force the enemy pilot into evasive maneuvering than to achieve a hit. The tracer round streaked past the hostile fighter as its pilot threw his aircraft into violent defensive turns that bled off airspeed and energy. Sarah pressed her attack, using superior position and energy to gradually close the distance for a killing shot. The enemy pilot proved his skill by reversing his turn at exactly the right moment, forcing Sarah to overshoot and giving him a brief opportunity for a snapshot as she passed in front of his aircraft. She felt impacts on Ghost Rider's airframe as enemy cannon rounds found their mark, but her damage display showed only minor hits to non-critical systems. Sarah extended away from the enemy fighter and climbed back to higher altitude, using the F-22's superior acceleration and climb rate to reset the engagement geometry. The enemy pilot attempted to follow her climb, but lacked the engine performance to match her aircraft's capabilities. She had successfully separated from the threat and could now re-engage on her own terms. During the brief respite, Sarah checked her tactical display and discovered that the second enemy fighter was approaching rapidly from the east. She would have to finish the current engagement quickly or risk being caught in the crossfire situation she had been trying to avoid. Time was running out, and she needed to eliminate threats faster than they could coordinate against her. Sarah selected her fourth AMRAAM and targeted the climbing enemy fighter at 15 miles range. The hostile pilot was still trying to match her climb rate and had limited maneuvering options due to his aircraft's energy state. She achieved a solid radar lock and fired the missile while beginning evasive maneuvering to prepare for the approaching second threat. The AMRAAM tracked perfectly this time, finding its target as the enemy pilot attempted a desperate defensive turn that came too late to defeat the incoming missile. The explosion lit up Sarah's peripheral vision as another hostile contact vanished from her displays. 3 down, 1 to go, but the remaining enemy fighter was now in ideal position to attack, while she was temporarily unable to maneuver aggressively. The last enemy pilot had used the distraction of the previous engagement to position himself for a perfect beam attack from Sarah's 3 o'clock position. He fired 2 missiles in rapid succession, forcing her to defend against multiple simultaneous threats while her own weapon systems cycle for the next engagement. Sarah dove toward lower altitude while dispensing chaff and flares in a carefully timed sequence designed to defeat both incoming missiles. The first hostile weapon detonated harmlessly in a cloud of aluminum chaff, but the second missile continued tracking with stubborn accuracy. She pulled Ghost Rider through a series of high-G barrel rolls that tested both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The second missile exploded close enough to cause significant damage to Sarah's aircraft. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel as multiple systems reported hits from missile fragments. Her left engine showed decreased thrust output, and her radar warning receiver indicated partial failure of her electronic warfare systems. Despite the damage, Ghost Rider remained flyable and combat-capable. Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this situation, and she compartmentalized her concerns about aircraft damage to focus on eliminating the final threat. The enemy pilot had revealed his position by firing missiles, and she now had a clear shot at ending the engagement. Sarah selected her 5th AMRAAM and targeted the last enemy fighter at 22 miles range. The hostile pilot was maneuvering aggressively to avoid her return fire, but his evasive actions were predictable patterns that her missile's guidance system could accommodate. She achieved lock-on and fired while simultaneously preparing for close-range combat, in case the shot missed. The final AMRAAM tracked flawlessly despite the enemy pilot's best efforts at evasion. Sarah watched the missile close the distance steadily, while the hostile fighter attempted increasingly desperate maneuvers to break the guidance lock. At the last possible moment, the enemy pilot ejected from his aircraft just before the missile impact destroyed his fighter completely. Silence returned to the radio frequencies as Sarah assessed her situation. 4 enemy fighters destroyed, no friendly casualties, and Ghost Rider still flyable despite battle damage. But her celebration was premature. Her radar display was beginning to show new contacts approaching from multiple directions, and the engagement she had just survived was apparently only the beginning of a much larger battle. Sarah's moment of victory was shattered when her radar screen erupted with new contacts. 8 additional enemy fighters were approaching from 3 different directions, their coordinated attack pattern suggesting this was the main assault force she had been warned about. The 4 fighters she had just destroyed were apparently an advanced screening element, sent to test American defenses and gather intelligence about their capabilities. Crown Control, Ghost Rider, she transmitted while assessing the developing tactical situation. Splash 4 hostiles, but I've got 8 more contacts inbound from multiple vectors. Request immediate backup. The response from the AWACS controller carried a note of desperation that Sarah had never heard before. Ghost Rider, nearest friendly aircraft are 20 minutes away minimum. You're going to have to hold them off alone until reinforcements arrive. New intelligence suggests these hostiles are part of a coordinated attack on major population centers along the eastern seaboard. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the full scope of the situation became clear. 8 enemy fighters against her single F-22, with millions of civilian lives potentially hanging in the balance. She had already expended 5 of her 8 air-to-air missiles, leaving her with only 3 AMRAAMs and limited ammunition for her cannon. The odds were impossible, but she was the only thing standing between these hostile aircraft and innocent people on the ground. The approaching enemy formation had split into 3 groups of varying sizes. The largest group consisted of 4 fighters approaching from the northeast, clearly the main striking force intended to punch through whatever defenses they encountered. 2 fighters approached from the southeast, probably intended as a flanking force to catch defenders focused on the primary threat. The final pair was approaching from due north, positioned to cut off any escape routes Sarah might attempt. Sarah's damaged aircraft was showing the effects of the previous engagement. Her left engine was operating at reduced power, limiting her ability to maintain supersonic speed for extended periods. Several of her electronic warfare systems were degraded, reducing her ability to defeat incoming missiles. Most critically, her radar was experiencing intermittent failures that created gaps in her situational awareness at exactly the wrong time. Despite these challenges, Sarah began planning her engagement strategy. She could not afford to fight all 8 enemies simultaneously, so she would have to use superior tactics and the F-22's remaining technological advantages to separate the threats and defeat them piecemeal. Her first priority would be to eliminate the northern pair before they could cut off her escape routes. Sarah turned toward the 2 fighters approaching from the north while climbing to maximum altitude. The F-22's ability to supercruise at high altitude would give her an energy advantage over opponents who might not possess similar capabilities. At 50,000 feet, she could force the enemy fighters to climb into thinner air where their engines might be less effective. The northern pair of enemy fighters detected her approach and began maneuvering to intercept. Their formation discipline remained tight, suggesting these were experienced pilots who understood formation tactics and mutual support. Sarah would have to be careful not to allow them to bracket her position where their combined firepower could overwhelm her defenses. At 30 miles from the northern pair, Sarah selected her 6th AMRAAM and targeted the lead enemy fighter. She needed to make every shot count given her limited remaining missiles, so she waited until she had achieved the most favorable firing solution possible. The enemy fighters were climbing toward her position, reducing their maneuvering options and making them more predictable targets. Sarah achieved radar lock and fired her sixth missile while immediately beginning evasive maneuvering to prepare for return fire. The enemy fighters responded predictably by launching their own missiles, forcing her to defend while her AMRAAM raced toward its target. She dispensed chaff and flares while diving toward lower altitude where her damaged aircraft would have more maneuvering options. The enemy return fire consisted of 2 missiles fired in rapid succession, both tracking her with deadly accuracy. Sarah's electronic warfare systems, already degraded from previous battle damage, struggled to provide effective countermeasures against the incoming threats. She was forced to rely primarily on violent maneuvering and chaff dispensing to defeat the hostile missiles. Sarah's 6th AMRAAM found its target perfectly, destroying the lead enemy fighter in a brilliant explosion that lit up the morning sky. 5 down, 7 to go, but the remaining missile from the destroyed fighter's wingman was still tracking her with stubborn determination. She pulled Ghost Rider through a crushing 9G turn that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The hostile missile detonated close enough to cause additional damage to Sarah's already wounded aircraft. More warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel as fragments peppered the F-22 skin and damaged additional systems. Her radar warning receiver failed completely, leaving her blind to enemy targeting attempts. Her left engine began running even rougher, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit. Despite the mounting damage, Sarah pressed her attack on the surviving fighter from the northern pair. The enemy pilot was maneuvering aggressively to avoid her return fire, while simultaneously trying to position himself for another missile shot. Sarah used her superior altitude and energy state to force him into defensive maneuvering that prevented him from achieving a firing solution. At 15 miles, Sarah fired her 7th AMRAAM at the maneuvering enemy fighter. The hostile pilot was ready for her attack and immediately began deploying countermeasures while executing violent evasive turns. Sarah watched her missile track toward the target while preparing for the close-range combat that would likely follow if the shot missed. The 7th AMRAAM scored a near miss that damaged the enemy fighter but failed to destroy it completely. Sarah could see smoke trailing from the hostile aircraft as its pilot struggled to maintain control of his damaged fighter. She pressed her attack with cannon fire, closing the distance for a gun's kill that would conserve her final missile for the remaining threats. The enemy pilot's damaged aircraft was losing altitude and speed, making it an easier target for Sarah's cannon. She lined up behind the smoking fighter and fired a long burst that found its mark with devastating effect. The enemy aircraft broke apart in a shower of debris, sending its pilot tumbling toward Earth in his ejection seat. 6 enemy fighters destroyed, but Sarah's celebration was premature. The main formation of 4 fighters from the northeast was now within missile range and beginning their attack. Her tactical display showed multiple missile launches as the enemy formation coordinated a massive salvo intended to overwhelm her remaining defenses through sheer volume of fire. Sarah counted at least 6 incoming missiles on her display, more than she could reasonably expect to defeat with her degraded countermeasures and damaged aircraft. She dove toward lower altitude while dispensing her remaining chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to confuse the incoming guidance systems. The F-22's speed and maneuverability were her only remaining advantages against such overwhelming firepower. The first 2 missiles detonated harmlessly in clouds of aluminum chaff, but the remaining 4 continued tracking with deadly accuracy. Sarah's damaged aircraft was struggling to maintain the high-G maneuvering required to defeat multiple simultaneous threats. Her damaged left engine was losing power rapidly, and she could feel the aircraft's performance degrading with each passing second. 3 more missiles detonated close enough to cause significant additional damage to Ghost Rider. Sarah's canopy cracked from the blast effects, and her right engine began showing warning indicators suggesting possible flameout. Multiple flight control systems reported failures or degraded operation. The F-22 was still flyable, but barely, and she was running out of options for defeating the remaining threats. The final incoming missile seemed destined to find its mark when Sarah's tactical display suddenly showed friendly contacts approaching from the west. 4 F-22s from her own squadron were racing toward the engagement area at maximum speed, their missile shots beginning to engage the enemy formation that had nearly overwhelmed her single aircraft. "Ghost Rider, this is Eagle Flight," came the welcome voice of Lieutenant Morrison over the radio. "We've got your back. Break left, and let's clean up these hostiles." Sarah was about to comply when she noticed something on her tactical display that made her blood run cold. The 2 fighter element from the southeast had detached from the main engagement and was racing toward a cluster of civilian radar contacts that appeared to be a commercial airliner with passenger escorts. The enemy fighters were apparently attempting to attack innocent civilians, while the American forces were distracted by the main aerial battle. "Eagle Flight, Ghost Rider," she transmitted while turning toward the new threat. 2 hostiles breaking toward civilian traffic bearing 180 degrees. "I'm in pursuit, but critically low on fuel and weapons." Sarah's fuel gauge showed that extended combat maneuvering and battle damage had consumed most of her remaining jet fuel. She had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining before she would be forced to attempt an emergency landing. Her weapons inventory consisted of 1 AMRAAM missile and limited cannon ammunition, hardly enough to engage 2 fresh enemy fighters. The race toward the civilian aircraft became a test of speed and determination. Sarah pushed her damaged F-22 to its absolute limits, coaxing every possible knot of airspeed from the failing engines while the enemy fighters closed the distance to their helpless targets. The commercial airliner was a sitting duck, completely defenseless against modern fighter aircraft. At maximum missile range, Sarah fired her final AMRAAM at the trailing enemy fighter. She had only 1 shot to make a difference, and she put everything she had learned about aerial combat into achieving the perfect firing solution. The missile streaked away toward its target while Sarah prepared for a gun's engagement with the remaining hostile aircraft. Her final missile strike was perfect, destroying the trailing enemy fighter just as it was preparing to fire on the defenseless airliner. But the lead enemy fighter was now within cannon range of the civilian aircraft, and Sarah was too far away to prevent the attack. She watched in horror as the hostile fighter lined up for what would surely be a massacre of innocent passengers. Sarah's response was immediate and desperate. She dove toward the enemy fighter at maximum speed, knowing that her arrival would be too late to prevent the initial attack, but hoping to disrupt the enemy pilot's aim enough to save at least some lives. Her damaged aircraft was screaming through the air at the very edge of structural failure, pushed far beyond its design limits by a pilot who refused to accept defeat. The enemy pilot detected Sarah's approach and was forced to maneuver to defend himself rather than complete his attack on the airliner. His shots went wide, missing the commercial aircraft by mere hundreds of feet as he turned to face Sarah's desperate charge. The civilian pilots, finally aware of their danger, began emergency evasive maneuvering that took them out of immediate range. Sarah's final engagement was fought with cannon fire at close range, 2 damaged fighters maneuvering desperately for position in a deadly dance that would determine whether innocent civilians lived or died. Her ammunition counter showed only seconds of firing time remaining, while her fuel gauge indicated that she was operating on fumes that could give out at any moment. The enemy pilot was skilled, and his aircraft was undamaged, giving him significant advantages in the close-range engagement. But Sarah's determination and superior training began to tell as she gradually gained position on her opponent. At 200 yards range, she fired her final cannon burst and watched the tracer rounds find their mark on the enemy fighter's engine section. The hostile aircraft began trailing fire and smoke as its pilot fought to maintain control. Sarah had no ammunition remaining to finish the job, but the enemy fighter was clearly in trouble and posed no further threat to civilian aircraft. She watched as the damaged enemy pilot attempted an emergency landing while her own fuel situation became critical. Ground control, Ghost Rider, Sarah transmitted as her engines began flaming out from fuel starvation. 8 hostiles destroyed, civilian traffic protected. I'm going down, but mission accomplished. As her aircraft began its final descent toward an emergency landing, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. She had been dismissed and underestimated by many of her colleagues, assigned to a reconnaissance mission that was considered safe and routine. Instead, she had found herself in the fight of her life against overwhelming odds, protecting innocent civilians while demonstrating exactly what a skilled pilot could accomplish in the right aircraft. The F-22 Raptor had proven itself to be every bit the technological marvel its designers had intended. But, more importantly, Sarah Chun had proven that skill, determination, and courage could overcome any odds. The enemy fighters had underestimated both the aircraft and its pilot, a mistake that had cost them dearly and prevented what could have been a devastating attack on American civilians. As Ghost Rider settled toward the ground on its final approach, Sarah knew that her career as a fighter pilot had been forever changed by this single morning's work. She had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious, earning the respect and recognition that had been denied her for too long. The sky belonged to those who had the courage to claim it, and today she had proven that courage knew no gender. Sarah's hands moved across the F-22's controls with practiced precision as both engines finally failed completely, leaving Ghost Rider gliding silently through the morning air like a 65,000-pound paper airplane. The sudden quiet in the cockpit was almost deafening after hours of engine noise and combat sounds. Only the whisper of air flowing over the aircraft's surfaces and the gentle hum of emergency battery-powered systems remained to break the eerie silence. Her altitude was 15,000 feet and decreasing rapidly. Without engine power, the F-22's glide ratio would give her perhaps 6 minutes to find a suitable landing site and execute what would essentially be a controlled crash. The nearest military airfield was 30 miles away, far beyond the aircraft's unpowered gliding capability. She needed to find a civilian airport, a highway, or any flat stretch of ground long enough to accommodate a dead-stick landing. Sarah's training kicked in as she began the emergency checklist burned into her memory through countless hours of simulator practice. She attempted to restart both engines, but the fuel flow indicators remained stubbornly at zero. Her fuel pumps had finally run dry after the extended combat maneuvering and battle damage had consumed every drop of jet fuel in Ghost Rider's tanks. She was committed to an unpowered landing whether she found a suitable runway or not. Mayday, 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 Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. This is Air Force Ghost Rider declaring emergency. Total engine failure. Attempting dead-stick landing. Position 30 miles southeast of Richmond, Virginia. Altitude 12,000 and descending. The response came immediately from multiple sources as civilian and military controllers coordinated to provide whatever assistance possible. Richmond Approach Control began vectoring all commercial traffic away from Sarah's projected flight path, while emergency services were alerted to prepare for a possible crash landing. Fire trucks and rescue helicopters began moving toward the area where her aircraft might come down. Sarah's eyes scanned the terrain below, searching for anything that might serve as a landing strip. The Virginia countryside was a patchwork of forests, farms, and suburban developments, none of which offered ideal conditions for landing a sophisticated fighter aircraft. She needed at least 8,000 feet of clear, flat ground to have any chance of surviving the landing, and such real estate was rare in this densely populated region. Her altimeter showed 10,000 feet when she spotted what might be her salvation. Interstate 64 stretched across the landscape like a concrete ribbon, its 4 lanes providing sufficient width and length for an emergency landing if she could time her approach correctly. The highway appeared relatively straight for several miles, offering her the best chance of finding enough clear space to get Ghost Rider on the ground safely. The challenge would be timing her approach to avoid civilian traffic while maintaining enough energy to reach the highway surface. Sarah had practiced similar scenarios in simulators, but the reality of flying a powerless fighter aircraft toward a busy interstate highway was far more complex than any training exercise. She would have only one chance to get the approach correct. Richmond Control, Ghost Rider, she transmitted while lining up for her approach to the interstate. I have Interstate 64 in sight and am attempting landing on a highway. Request immediate closure of all traffic in both directions between mile markers 180 and 190. The response confirmed that state police were already moving to block traffic access to the relevant section of interstate highway. Sarah watched through her cracked canopy as police cars with flashing lights began stopping vehicles and directing them away from her intended landing zone. The coordination between military and civilian authorities was impressive, but she knew that some traffic would inevitably remain on the highway when she arrived. At 5,000 feet, Sarah configured Ghost Rider for landing by lowering the landing gear and adjusting flight controls for minimum airspeed. The F-22's sophisticated fly-by-wire system was still operational on battery power, providing computer assistance for the difficult task of controlling an unpowered aircraft. Without these systems, the landing would have been virtually impossible. Sarah could see individual vehicles on the highway below as she continued her descent. Most of the traffic had been successfully cleared by state police, but a few cars remained scattered along her intended landing path. She would have to thread the needle between these obstacles while managing a landing approach that had no margin for error. Too fast, and she would overrun the available space. Too slow, and she would stall the aircraft short of the runway. The approach required perfect energy management as Sarah balanced airspeed against altitude to arrive at the highway surface with just enough speed to maintain control, but not so much that she couldn't stop before running out of concrete. She used the F-22's speed brakes and careful control inputs to bleed off excess energy while maintaining the precise glide path that would bring her to the highway surface. At 1,000 feet, Sarah could see people abandoning their vehicles and running away from the highway as they realized a military aircraft was about to land among them. She felt a moment of guilt about the terror she was causing these innocent civilians, but she had no choice except to land where circumstances allowed. The alternative was to crash in a populated area where the consequences would be far worse. The final approach was a test of nerve and skill that few pilots would ever experience. Sarah held the aircraft steady on its glide path while the highway rushed up toward her at 180 miles per hour. The concrete surface looked impossibly narrow and short as it grew larger in her windscreen. She had one chance to get this right, and failure would likely mean death for both herself and any civilians who remained in the vicinity. Ghost Rider's main landing gear touched the concrete surface with a tremendous impact that sent shockwaves through the aircraft structure. Sarah immediately applied maximum wheel brakes and deployed the F-22's drag chute while steering carefully to avoid the abandoned vehicles scattered along her landing path. The fighter aircraft streaked down the highway, trailing a cloud of rubber smoke and sparks from its brakes. A family had abandoned their minivan directly in Sarah's landing path, and she was forced to steer around the vehicle with only feet to spare. The F-22's landing gear was never designed for such maneuvering on concrete highways, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to depart from the narrow confines of the roadway. Only perfect control inputs kept Ghost Rider tracking straight down the center of the interstate. The deceleration forces threw Sarah forward against her restraint system as the aircraft's speed decreased from 180 miles per hour to 100, then 50, and finally to a complete stop just short of an overpass that would have destroyed both aircraft and pilot. She had used every foot of available concrete and most of her luck, but Ghost Rider was on the ground and intact. Emergency vehicles that had been racing toward her position began arriving within minutes of her landing. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, and military rescue helicopters converged on the section of interstate where the F-22 sat motionless among abandoned civilian vehicles. Sarah began her post-flight shutdown checklist while waiting for ground crews to secure her aircraft. The canopy opening system was damaged from battle, so Sarah had to use the manual backup to open her cockpit and escape from the damaged fighter. As she climbed down from Ghost Rider's cockpit, she was surrounded by emergency personnel who had been expecting to deal with a crashed aircraft and possibly injured pilot. Instead, they found Sarah walking away from what had been a textbook emergency landing under impossible circumstances. Paramedics insisted on examining Sarah for injuries, despite her protests that she felt fine. The physical stress of high-G combat maneuvering followed by the psychological pressure of an emergency landing had taken more of a toll than she initially realized. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline, and she discovered multiple minor injuries from missile fragments that had penetrated the cockpit during the aerial battle. Colonel Rodriguez arrived by helicopter 30 minutes after Sarah's landing, his face showing relief mixed with amazement as he surveyed the intact F-22 sitting on a Virginia interstate highway. Sarah had not only survived impossible odds in aerial combat, but had also successfully executed an emergency landing that most pilots would have considered suicidal. The combination of skill, luck, and determination required for such a feat was extraordinary. "Captain Shun," the colonel said as he approached Sarah where she sat on the back of an ambulance. "I've been flying fighters for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished this morning. 8 confirmed kills in 15 minutes. Including 4 in your first engagement, and for more while flying a damaged aircraft low on fuel and ammunition." Sarah looked back at Ghost Rider, sitting incongruously among the civilian vehicles on the highway. The F-22 skin was peppered with holes from missile fragments. Its left engine was blackened from battle damage, and its canopy was cracked from blast effects. The aircraft that had carried her through the morning's combat looked as exhausted as she felt, but both pilot and machine had survived to fight another day. News helicopters were already circling overhead, drawn by reports of a military aircraft landing on a major highway. Sarah realized that her morning's work would soon become public knowledge, bringing attention she had never sought but perhaps needed. For too long, skilled female combat pilots had operated in the shadows, their achievements known only within military circles that were often reluctant to acknowledge their contributions. "Sir," Sarah said to Colonel Rodriguez, "I was just doing my job. Those enemy fighters threatened civilian aircraft and population centers. Someone had to stop them, and I happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right aircraft." The colonel smiled at Sarah's characteristic modesty, but his expression also showed the respect that her morning's achievements had earned. "Captain, what you accomplished today wasn't just doing your job. It was extraordinary flying against impossible odds. You've proven something that needed proving, and I suspect this won't be the last time we hear about your achievements." As military personnel began the complex process of removing Ghost Rider from the interstate highway, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few hours. She had awakened that morning as a competent but somewhat overlooked fighter pilot assigned to routine reconnaissance duties. She was ending the day as the pilot who had single-handedly defeated a coordinated enemy air attack while protecting innocent civilians. The physical evidence of her achievements was undeniable. 8 enemy aircraft had been destroyed, civilian lives had been saved, and she had survived an emergency landing that would become legendary among military aviators. But more importantly, Sarah had proven that skill and determination were more important than gender in determining a pilot's combat effectiveness. Intelligence officers were already beginning their investigation into the identity and origins of the enemy aircraft Sarah had encountered. The sophisticated fighters and skilled pilots suggested a major military power with advanced capabilities, but their identity remained a mystery that would require extensive analysis to resolve. What was certain was that they had underestimated both American defensive capabilities and the pilot who had defeated them. As Sarah climbed into the helicopter that would return her to base for debriefing and medical evaluation, she caught a final glimpse of Ghost Rider surrounded by emergency vehicles and news crews. The aircraft had been her partner in the morning's victory, and she felt a moment of sadness at leaving the damaged fighter behind. Together, they had accomplished something that would be remembered for generations to come. The helicopter lifted off from the highway, carrying Sarah back toward Nellis Air Force Base, where her superiors would begin the process of understanding exactly what had happened in the skies over Virginia. But Sarah already knew the most important truth. When the stakes were highest and the odds seemed impossible, American fighter pilots could still make the difference between victory and defeat. Today, one of those pilots had happened to be a woman who refused to accept limitations that others tried to place on her capabilities 3 weeks after the aerial battle that would later be known as the Virginia Engagement. Captain Sarah Chun found herself in the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, facing a panel of senior military officers, intelligence officials, and government analysts who were still trying to understand the full implications of what had occurred that morning. The room's sterile atmosphere and fluorescent lighting felt surreal after the chaotic intensity of aerial combat and the peaceful Virginia countryside where she had landed Ghost Rider. The debriefing had been extensive and ongoing. Every detail of the engagement had been analyzed, from the initial radar contacts to the final emergency landing on Interstate 64. Sarah's gun camera footage had been reviewed frame by frame, her radio transmissions analyzed for intelligence value, and her tactical decisions dissected by experts who marveled at the split-second thinking that had enabled her to defeat 8 enemy fighters while protecting civilian aircraft. General Patricia Williams, the Air Force's highest-ranking female officer, sat at the head of the briefing table with a mixture of pride and amazement on her weathered face. She had spent decades fighting for recognition of women's capabilities in combat roles, often facing skepticism and resistance from traditionalists who questioned whether female pilots could perform under the ultimate pressure of life and death aerial combat. Sarah's achievements had provided the definitive answer to those questions. Captain Chun, General Williams began, her voice carrying the authority earned through 30 years of military service. The intelligence community has finally identified the origin of the aircraft you encountered. They were advanced fighters belonging to a hostile nation that has been developing stealth technology and training elite pilots for what appears to have been a planned attack on American population centers and military installations. Sarah listened intently as the briefing continued with details about the enemy's capabilities and intentions. The fighters she had faced represented the cutting edge of foreign military technology, operated by pilots who had undergone years of advanced training specifically for missions against American forces. Their defeat had not only saved lives, but had also provided invaluable intelligence about potential future threats. The enemy's plan, continued Colonel James Harrison from Air Force Intelligence, involved multiple phases of attack designed to overwhelm our defensive systems through coordinated strikes on radar installations, command centers, and civilian targets. Your engagement disrupted their timeline and forced them to abort subsequent phases of the operation. Intelligence estimates suggest that your actions prevented attacks that could have killed thousands of civilians. The weight of this revelation settled on Sarah like a physical presence in the room. She had known that civilian lives were at stake during the engagement, but the full scope of what she had prevented was only now becoming clear. The enemy had planned a comprehensive attack on American infrastructure and population centers, and her single aircraft had served as the crucial defensive barrier that prevented catastrophic loss of life. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the Defense Intelligence Agency presented the technical analysis of the enemy aircraft that had been recovered from crash sites. The fighters you engaged, Captain Chun, represented technology that we had not previously encountered. Their stealth capabilities were more advanced than our intelligence estimates had suggested, and Their electronic warfare systems were sophisticated enough to challenge even our most advanced defensive measures. Sarah found it fascinating that the aircraft she had fought were apparently more advanced than American intelligence had realized. This made her victory even more significant from a technological standpoint, proving that superior pilot skill and tactical thinking could overcome technological disadvantages. The F-22 Raptor was still the world's most capable fighter aircraft, but in the right hands, it could defeat even more advanced opponents. The briefing continued with psychological analysis of Sarah's performance under extreme stress. Military psychologists had been studying her decisions and reactions during the engagement, trying to understand how she had maintained effectiveness while facing overwhelming odds and life-threatening situations. Their conclusions would influence future pilot training programs and selection criteria. Captain Chen's performance profile explained Dr. Michael Torres, the Air Force's chief aviation psychologist, demonstrates exceptional stress tolerance, situational awareness, and decision-making capability under extreme pressure. Her ability to maintain tactical thinking while managing multiple simultaneous threats represents the highest level of combat pilot performance we have ever documented. Sarah felt somewhat uncomfortable being analyzed like a laboratory specimen, but she understood the importance of learning from her experiences to improve future pilot training. If her achievements could help other aviators prepare for similar situations, then the intense scrutiny was worthwhile. Combat aviation had always been about learning from experience and applying those lessons to future challenges. The most significant revelation came when General Williams announced the results of the investigation into the broader enemy operation. Intelligence sources have confirmed that this attack was intended as the opening phase of a larger conflict. The enemy believed they could cripple our defensive capabilities with a surprise attack, followed by conventional military operations against targets throughout the region. The implications of this information were staggering. Sarah's actions had not just prevented a terrorist attack or isolated incident, but had actually disrupted the opening moves of what could have been a major military conflict. By defeating the enemy's initial strike force, she had forced them to reconsider their entire strategic approach and potentially prevented a war that could have involved multiple nations. Captain, General Williams continued, your achievements that morning have had strategic implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The enemy's failure to execute their planned attack has caused them to reconsider their aggressive intentions. Our intelligence suggests that they have postponed indefinitely any further military operations against American interests. Sarah began to understand why this debriefing had involved such high-ranking officials and extensive analysis. Her 15 minutes of aerial combat had not just been a successful defensive action, but had actually influenced the strategic balance between major military powers. The enemy's realization that American defensive capabilities were more effective than they had calculated had forced them to reassess their entire approach to international relations. The meeting concluded with General Williams presenting Sarah with several commendations and awards that recognized her extraordinary achievements. The Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, and several other decorations would be formally presented in a ceremony attended by senior government officials and media representatives. Captain Chen, the general said as she handed Sarah the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, your actions that morning represent the finest traditions of American military aviation. You've demonstrated that individual skill, courage, and determination can still make the difference in modern warfare, regardless of technological advantages or numerical superiority. Sarah accepted the awards with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire career. She understood their significance, both for her personally and for the broader recognition of women's capabilities in combat roles. But she also knew that the real reward was the knowledge that she had protected innocent lives and served her country when it needed her most. The aftermath of the Virginia engagement brought changes that extended far beyond Sarah's personal recognition. The Air Force began reassessing its policies regarding women in combat roles, acknowledging that gender was irrelevant to combat effectiveness when pilots possessed the necessary skills and training. Sarah's achievements had provided irrefutable evidence that female pilots could perform at the highest levels under the most demanding circumstances. Lieutenant Morrison, who had initially questioned Sarah's assignment to the reconnaissance mission, approached her after the Pentagon briefing with an expression of genuine respect and admiration. "Captain Chun," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to question your capabilities, and what you accomplished that morning was nothing short of extraordinary. I'd be honored to fly as your wingman anytime." Sarah accepted his handshake and apology with grace, understanding that changing long-held attitudes was a gradual process that required patience and demonstration rather than confrontation. Morrison's change of heart was representative of a broader shift in military thinking about women's roles in combat aviation. The media attention following the engagement was intense, but carefully managed by military public affairs officers who understood the importance of controlling the narrative. Sarah's story became a symbol of American military excellence and gender equality, inspiring young women across the country to consider careers in aviation and military service. Her achievements proved that the sky truly belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to claim it. Technical analysis of Ghost Rider's battle damage provided valuable insights for future F-22 upgrades and pilot training programs. The aircraft's ability to continue fighting despite significant damage demonstrated the robust design philosophy that had gone into its development. Sarah's ability to continue operating effectively with degraded systems proved that proper training could help pilots overcome technological failures through skill and determination. 6 months after the Virginia engagement, Sarah was promoted to major and assigned to the Air Force's elite test pilot school, where her combat experience and analytical skills would contribute to the development of next-generation fighter aircraft. Her new role would allow her to influence the design of future air superiority fighters, ensuring that lessons learned from her combat experience would be incorporated into tomorrow's military aviation capabilities. The enemy fighters she had defeated were eventually identified as products of a secret military development program that had been years in the making. Their destruction had not only prevented immediate attacks, but had also eliminated years of technological development and pilot training that would be difficult for the enemy to replace. Sarah's victory had strategic implications that would influence international relations for years to come. At the test pilot school, Sarah found herself working alongside the military's most experienced aviators, both male and female, in an environment where capability mattered more than gender. Her combat experience brought a unique perspective to aircraft development programs that had previously relied primarily on peacetime testing and simulation. Real-world combat data was invaluable for designing systems that would perform under actual battle conditions. The F-22 program incorporated several modifications based on lessons learned from Sarah's engagement, including improved battle damage tolerance, enhanced electronic warfare capabilities, and modified pilot training programs that emphasized single-pilot operations against multiple threats. Ghost Rider itself was eventually restored to full operational status and became a training aircraft for advanced combat scenarios. Sarah's story became part of Air Force legend, taught to new pilots as an example of what individual excellence could accomplish under impossible circumstances. Flight instructors used her engagement as a case study in tactical thinking, weapons employment, and decision-making under pressure. Her 15 minutes of combat became a teaching tool that would influence military aviation training for generations. Years later, as Colonel Sarah Chun looked back on the morning that changed her life and career, she reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred that day. She had proven that skill, courage, and determination were more important than gender in determining combat effectiveness. Her achievements had opened doors for future generations of female combat pilots and had demonstrated that America's military strength came from utilizing the talents of all its citizens. The enemy had underestimated her, because of their preconceptions about women in combat roles, and that underestimation had cost them dearly. 8 advanced fighters and their pilots have been lost because they failed to recognize that the pilot facing them was one of the most skilled aviators in the world. Their mistake had become her opportunity to prove what she had always known. The sky belonged to those with the courage and skill to claim it, regardless of what others might believe about their limitations. As she continued her career in test flying and aircraft development, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that she had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. The Virginia engagement had lasted only 15 minutes, but its effects would influence military aviation and gender equality for decades to come. She had not sought to become a symbol or a legend, but circumstances had thrust her into that role, and she had proven worthy of the responsibility. The morning when Sarah Chun took down 8 enemy jets in just 15 minutes had become more than just a military victory. It had become proof that heroes come in all forms, and that underestimating someone based on preconceptions rather than capabilities was a mistake that could have catastrophic consequences. In the unforgiving arena of aerial combat, skill and determination mattered more than anything else, and Sarah had possessed both in abundance when her country needed them most.